My name is Chris Gerling. I'm an Extension Associate for Enology at Cornell, and I work at the Cornell Agritech at the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station in Geneva. And we're happy to have you here today to talk about wastewater usage and winery sustainability. I am lucky to be joined by Ken Schlafer and Dave Pfister, who are from the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute, also known as P2I. You'll hear them using, I think, that terminology later in the webinar. They are housed at the Rochester Institute of Technology at RIT. And so we're happy to have them here today to share their expertise. And so the way this webinar is going to go is, first I'm going to take you through the current state of the regulations for winery wastewater in New York. And then Ken is going to come and tell us about the what the RIT P2I and what it does, and the services they offer and the resources that they have. And I think then Dave is going to finish off by launching into a sustainable workbook that for wineries that we have been working on collaboratively over the last couple of years, and that we hope to present as a tool for the New York State wine industry going forward. So this webinar is being recorded today. If you miss some or all of it, we will post that, and we'll send out an email to everybody who is registered for this webinar. You'll get a follow-up email with that link to that webinar so that you can watch it at your leisure, or review it. And we will also be sending out a very short survey link, just talking about a little bit of follow-up of what we talk about today. It's got 5 questions, and one of those questions is to enter your email address if you're interested. So I swear, it should take 3 minutes at the most. So we would appreciate people filling out that survey when we send out that link. All right, so with all those mechanics and logistics out of the way, I think we can launch into this webinar and get everything rolling so that we can be finished and have time for questions. And once again, if you do have questions, you can type those in the chat pod and we will get to them possibly during the course of the webinar, or possibly when we're done with the slides, depending on how the flow works out. All right. So let's start with a look at the winery wastewater regulations in New York as they are, and how they might be changing in the relatively near future. So most of you probably know this already, but craft beverage production in New York is considered an industrial process, and therefore the waste that is generated through this industrial process is industrial waste. And this is true whether you're making wine, beer, cider, distilled spirits, any of these products. Although we may view it as agricultural nature, it is technically part of a food production process and is therefore classified as industrial. And so what are your options for dealing with this type of waste? The DEC has put out a Q&A, and this is an excerpt from that Q&A. And so you have basically 4 main options. And the primary one is to discharge to a properly permitted on-site septic system. The next thing you can do is, if you are on municipal system, you may be able to connect to a municipal public system if you meet the requirements of that municipal system, and you're properly connected already. You can avoid all these things by if you pump all of your wastewater into an impermeable tank and have somebody take it away to another public water treatment facility or some other place like that. So if you just have a tank that is made of concrete, or it could even be impervious plastic, and there's no way that your water will be escaping from that tank, and it's pumped away, then you don't have to have a permit. Finally, there is an option to land apply to agricultural fields. We'll talk a little bit more about this. So you can spread it at agronomic rates across agricultural land to dispense with your water. That's also a viable option. So what do we mean by a properly permitted system? Going back to option A there, the environmental conservation law that you see listed here requires a speedies permit to make or use a disposal system for the discharge of industrial waste. As we mentioned, our waste is industrial, and so we need to deal with that. which may or might reasonably be expected to cause pollution to the waters of the state, including groundwater. So to kind of pull back from this a little bit, a septic system, a leach field system that is to which you are pumping winery waste would need the SPEEDIES permit. And in case you're wondering what SPEEDIES stands for, it stands for State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And so that's the permit that you need, and it has to be designed by a licensed engineer and improved by the engineers at the DEC. Each site needs to have its own, will have its own specifications, and based on the site and the volumes and all the data collection that you do, you'll find they'll set limits and thresholds, and there'll be monitoring that may be quarterly, it may be monthly, depending on the flows, depending on the measurements and all that. And so this is it's a fairly intense process. It takes time, and it takes money to both go through this process, just to carry it out, and also to have it designed, and then the installation can make it a fairly arduous process. And the way it's designed now, each and every winery or cidery must go through it individually and must develop their own set of plans and their own monitoring protocols and their own limits and all these things. And so this is the way the law stands now, if this is the route that you choose. So over in the dairy industry, they've come up with a general permit for the CAFOs, for the concentrated animal feeding operations. So what they said is that most of these dairies are relatively similar, right? They're in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it. Obviously, the composition of the waste is relatively similar, and so maybe if all these people are doing relatively similar things in similar ways, then we don't necessarily have to make each of them go through an individual process. We can come up with a generalized set of guidelines for these similar types of businesses, and using those guidelines, we will apply what's called a general permit. And so that means that you do not have to individually apply, but you do have to meet the conditions, obviously, of the general permit. And so this has been done for dairy, and the DEC is considering this kind of approach for craft beverages as well, seeing as we also have similar flows, similar composition of the flows, operations doing the same things. And so it makes sense to also have a general permit in this type of arena. And so the qualifications for the notice of, in the spring, the DEC released a notice of proposed permit, an MPP, and the general permit was proposed to qualify wineries, breweries, and cideries in New York State, the discharge process wastewaters, with or without the mixing of sanitary wastewater, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and some options for that and why you might not want to do that. But this is currently, taking it either into account for groundwater, and so this is for less than 10,000 gallons per day. At this point, that is a maximum. There is no minimum in that notice of proposed permit. So anybody with less than 10,000 gallons per day would be potentially covered by that permit. So they made in the general permit guidelines, they made procedures for both existing facilities and new facilities. An existing facility would get a licensed engineer and assess their current system to make sure everything is operating correctly and being properly maintained. So that's relatively straightforward. For a new facility, you would need to retain a licensed engineer, and they had some criteria that you had to meet in that, for the new one, that may have been a little more extensive. But so there's a couple of choices there. The general guidelines would call for flow monitoring and regular inspection, periodic sampling and analysis, and some record keeping and reporting, whether you were a new or existing system. So there would be a little bit of work involved to comply. And if you want to see the full proposed general permit, you can follow this link, and we can send out this link as part of the follow-up email, so you can check this out. One thing to be clear about when I was speaking with DEC is that this is not, that was not a draft. That was a pre-draft, basically. So the next step in their process would be to submit another draft, which would also have a public comment period. So while it's not what you see in this in the notice of proposed permit are not the final conditions yet. They are obviously indicative of the DEC's thinking, I think, up to this point. And so while the public comment period officially closed, I think, at the beginning of May or so, it sounds like they very much are still interested in your feedback. If you have feelings about this permit, or about the conditions that they set out that you would like to address, they're still very much interested in hearing from the industry about what parts of this you like and don't like. So it's the official comment period is closed, but I think you can still, if you still have feedback, they'd like to hear it. And yeah, the next step along the way would be a draft of another permit, which may or may not have the same exact specs, but it's just something to be aware of going forward. All right, so what do we know based on these regulations? The first is that everybody that I've ever talked to who knows anything about wastewater engineering and everything like that says you should separate your sanitary waste, your bathroom waste, from your process and production waste for a few different reasons. If you have just a standard sanitary septic system, so you're using a septic system just for bathroom waste or whatever, and you're under 1,000 gallons per day, that doesn't need a speedies permit, first of all. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The next thing is that once you do, if you do have those waste streams connected, that is not eligible for the land application, which we'll talk about a little bit more below. So that reduces your options. And of course, finally, if you're going to build one kind of flow handling and then management system for all this waste, if you've got sanitary waste that's going to add to your total flows for the system that you need to build. So you're going to have to build a more extensive, more expensive system to handle that. So if you can avoid commingling those streams, you'll save yourself headaches in a few different ways. And further along those lines, if you have solid processing waste, if you have stems, skins, seeds, things like that, that is defined agricultural waste, I believe is how it's officially classified. That can be composted or land applied with no permitting or registration. So as long as you keep that separate, you can spread that out as compost in a vineyard or compost in another kind of agricultural field or whatever, and that does not need to be permitted. So keeping the solid waste separate is also useful. And finally, we mentioned this a couple times. One of the things that is available to anybody who's got any amount of land, and it does not take much land, ag land, is that they can land apply their wastewater as well. As long as you are doing it at what is termed to be, best practices and reasonable agronomic rates, which is not clearly defined, but I think you can understand that you don't want probably standing water in your fields. But it doesn't take very much land to spread a lot of wastewater in our experience. So this is a really good option for people who are not, in urban environments. And if it's a permit process, so it's kind of a one-time registration where you send in a form. You don't need engineer stamps. You don't need designs or anything like that. You just have to have basic, so, it's a pretty simple form. And once you've done that registration, you can go ahead and apply, and you won't have to, there won't be flow monitoring, there won't be testing or anything like that. So that's a really good option for people who have fields, who have land available to do that. And it takes less land, I think, than most people think. So definitely worth exploring. My understanding, the DC does not plan to take away this option or alter this option going forward with any kind of general permit. They may change the name. I think when I talk to them, it might not be Part 360. It might be a different part. But as far as that goes, that will be still an option going forward. All right. So that's a quick tour of the regulations and some of your choices out there. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ken to talk to us about New York State Pollution Prevention Institute and some of the options and resources available through P2I. Let's get this up and running. I think should be good to go. And just click and pass along.
Okay, excellent. Hey, well, thanks again, Chris. I appreciate the introduction. And as Chris had mentioned up front, my name is Ken Schlafer and my colleague is Dave Pfister. We both work in the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute, or as Chris had mentioned, the New York State P2I group. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of our capabilities within P2I, and Dave will continue on and focus on some of the sustainability workbook practices around wineries. So we're located in Rochester, New York at RIT within the Golisano Institute for Sustainability. The group New York State P2I has been around since 2008. Our funding is provided by the EPA, administered by the DEC in New York State. In fact, RIT just won a $19.5 million award from the DEC, and that really allows us to continue our projects and initiatives for the next upcoming 5 years. So we're really proud of that continuation, and we're really looking to help a lot of different companies along the way, including wineries. And I'll explain it in a couple minutes, but we have been trying to do a lot more partnerships with partner universities like Cornell, in working with Chris in the wine community. And so we're really looking forward to some of those continued collaborations. So one of the things I was hoping to walk you through is just our overall goal and mission within P2I. We're really focused on reducing environmental footprint across New York State. And you can kind of see that with some of the metrics and some of the impacts we've identified on our screen here. We focus upstream with green engineering, water conservation and recycling, energy use, and wastewater reductions. That's really our focus. We work with companies to collect metrics after successful implementations. And as of 2017, September 2017, you can see we've helped over 240 companies to date. And so with those 240 companies, you can kind of see some of the metrics that we've collected along the way. So when we work with the company, we typically do it in two phases. We first do the screening up front. We listen to some of the pain points, understand their process. And then from that, we will look for potential opportunities and look for the big hitters to reduce cost. I know cost is always an important piece of it, and we really focus on the costs and how that has an impact on environmental waste streams and energy use and things like that. There's no risk or financial cost for these initial screenings, but that's really kind of the focus up front is the assessments and the screening. Then we get into more of the assessment phase. We work with the company to write a detailed scope of work, including all the tasks that we've laid out. And then New York State, through that the grant that we were awarded, offsets a large percentage of the project costs. The company will pay a minimal fee based off of the project work. As you can see on the slide, we have good coverage across resources within the state. We have, as I had mentioned up front, we have 5 partner universities that we have partnerships with. They include Cornell University, you can see them at the bottom, RPI, Clarkson University, RIT, and Binghamton University. We also have 11 manufacturing extension partnerships, or MEP centers, scattered throughout the state, as well as 15 plus incubators that provides us a lot of support along the way. So one of the things I really wanted to focus in on was our core programs. You can kind of see those 5 programs, 5 core programs on the slide. And I just wanted to kind of walk you through some of the projects we work on in this space, as well as the community and communication and outreach activities that we do to help with tech transfer. So when you look at reduction of environmental footprint, this is a lot of direct assistance to companies and wineries along our work. We provide technical resources and assistance to companies to find environmental opportunities. And that leads to really productivity and efficiency gains along the way. And so typical projects that we work on in this space is water conservation and recycling, energy use and renewables, waste reduction, and toxic use reduction. So any of those types of projects we focus on in that space. We also are focused on sustainable business practices as well. We have a program focused on that, assisting businesses with identifying gaps in their business practices. Some of these programs are focused on the supply chain and in helping with certifications like ISO 14001, and then also setting up customer scorecards and questionnaires to help maybe improve their customer relationships and supplier relationships, and just purchasing and supplier program development. So it's really a lot of those types of tasks and activities we do for that program. A big one that we're really getting more involved with is food waste reduction and diversion. We really help guide a lot of the businesses across New York State to more sustainable food systems by providing information and tools around reducing and recovering food resources. So that's getting a lot of traction, a lot of good movement there. Another program is accelerating commercialization of green products. We do a lot of product assessments for a lot of startup companies where there could be some environmental impact, positive environmental impact. We will do a lot of the assessment testing to just truly validate that for the company itself. There's also an R&D arm where we will do a lot of applied research that will help with near-term solutions. So we work with our partner universities in that space. And then obviously the communication and outreach. We really are focused on helping companies and communities across all of those 5 programs, but we want to make sure we also do a lot of tech transfer along the way. So we're really helping the broader community across New York State with reducing pollution. So those are just some of the capabilities that we do within P2I. I thought it was important because it's really focused on the upstream. What can we do from a source reduction standpoint? I think it's key, and it really hits home, because if we can reduce the sources up front, it helps minimize any kind of regulation requirements downstream. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave, and he'll kind of walk us through some of the workbook activities that we've been collaborating with Chris on.
Hi, I'm Dave Pfister, and I was thinking about how many projects we've already done with wineries and breweries, and I think we're up to like 12 or 13, mostly wineries. So we've already gotten ourselves familiar with, what kind of activities actually occur on wineries. And Cornell put out I don't remember what exactly it's called, a workbook or that spiral bound that has information on viticulture.
Oh, vine balance.
Vine balance, yes. Sorry. So this is an attempt with this workbook that we're working on now to not look at the field type activities, but now to look at what's going on in the winery. So that's the point of what we're going through right now. So the whole idea is looking at sustainability associated with the actual winery operation. And we'll talk a little bit about what everybody means by sustainability. And it's not, if you ask somebody, there's always somebody saying, well, no, it actually means this, or I think it means this and this. But the whole point of sustainability is environmental resources, social resources, and economic resources. So those are typically called the three pillars. But within that workbook, we're going to be covering some of the items such as how to do a self-assessment, how to actually, what kind of best practices is occurring right now, and then actually looking at what can we do to reduce things like energy, toxic waste, which would probably be cleaning supplies, and then also the energy portion. So again, back to what sustainability is. You can look at what they call the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, triple bottom line, corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship. They all are kind of buzzwords for sustainability. The Brundtland Commission, which came up with the actual definition for, I'm just went blank. Oh well, for the UN sustainability definition. So that's down below, and it's development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's kind of the core of the definition for sustainability. Not going to belabor it because, again, that's the generic information. In terms of how you deal with sustainability, we have the actual sustainability plan that you would want to go through. And this, by the way, is in the workbook as a draft form right now. So how do you plan sustainability? And what do you do with water use? What do you do with energy use, material use, and waste? So this assessment will cover those items and say, here's how you get from A to B to C to D to E. And don't worry about the small boxes to the right. They're probably somewhat difficult to read, but the whole idea is within sustainability, you're always looking at what you're trying to do, how to measure it, how to analyze it, what to do with that information once you've analyzed it, how to actually communicate that to employees or upper management or however that organization is set up. Finally, what improvements you can make, what kind of controls you can put into place to keep the improvements going. And then the cycle begins again to look at other ways to actually make those changes and improvements. Okay, actual things going on a winery. So that item 1 under the approach, and Chris did a really good job of talking about where New York State is headed with the regulations for wineries as in industries producing industrial waste. One of the things we've seen as we've worked with various wineries is typically a winery has limited water resources, i.e. typically on a well. What happens if you are using the well to its limits? What happens when you have drought like this summer? But what are your limits right now is part of the water end of it. Evaluating what your baseline looks like. And again, with some exceptions, harvest time is the heavy water use. Although as the hospitality end of the winery starts to grow, it's starting to look like there are other factors that are affecting the actual water use. And then setting targets. What do you do to try to make changes to improve? In this case, let's talk about water use. So we have these two arrows that say, okay, here's your water use. Well, can you measure, or can you come up with a standard method for measuring water use? And that's already been done. It's usually gallons of water per case of wine. And then again, to find out where the water use is actually occurring, we usually work with a winery to try to look at where you can submeter to determine where your high water use areas are. Then finally, for wastewater generation, the things that become important when you start to deal with the wastewater, if you are stuck with trying to come up with ways to deal with it, besides, for instance, field spreading, is total suspended solids, the BOD or biological oxygen demand, and then whatever cleaning chemicals are in that water, which again could affect even something as what you would call simple as sending that wastewater to your local wastewater treatment facility. In terms of improvements, again, focusing on the water end of things, what we've found are fairly helpful for most wineries is to look at low flow spray nozzles. So what's at the end of your hose when you're spraying down floors, spraying down the outside of tanks, things of that sort. High pressure spray unit looks pretty useful for doing the crush pad equipment, cleaning up at the end of every day. And then low flow CIP balls, the spray balls that you're actually using in your tanks to do some of the cleaning between product runs. And then finally, water recovery and reuse. If you have a CIP system, to be able to reuse some of that final rinse water for initial rinsing. So that becomes a bit of a issue if you are limited on floor space for storing that water. But if you're limited on water use, then it becomes important to make use of as much water as many times as you can before you actually dispose of it. In terms of the energy part of this, one easy way to deal with energy use is, for starters, look at your billing and actually plot the billing, for instance, for electricity, and say, okay, do I have high electricity use, and when does it happen? Is it mostly in the summertime, and maybe now we're talking air conditioning in the hospitality area? Is it in the fall and winter where we're doing titrate stabilization? Are there things we can do for any of those items to try to look at improving that use? Even simple things like converting and retrofitting lighting. So again, let's say the hospitality area has a lot of fluorescent lighting. Maybe start looking at switching over to LED lighting. Heat recovery in terms of energy could be something simple like a heat exchanger when you're, in the case of a brewery, for instance, bringing your wort temperature back down. And then operational changes such as, making sure employees know that they're supposed to turn lights out when they walk out of an area, which gets into employee behavior. Don't leave hoses on, don't leave lights on, make sure everything's shut down, watch for leaks. So a lot of that kind of stuff where you can say, I can do this fairly easily, but we have to make sure everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. In the winery business, a study was done a few years ago in California, and refrigeration was #1 for energy use. And again, that's most likely to be tartrate stabilization. Lighting was #2. Now you look down at some of those other items that are on this list. Electrodialysis is being heavily used in California for titrate removal as opposed to refrigeration for stabilization. Compressed air is kind of a generic item for any company that uses compressed air. You got to watch for leaks. Ambient air cooling, again, upstate New York, depending on how cooperative the winter is. Yes, you can use the outside air for tartrate stabilization. And then tank installation, chiller line installation, things of that sort to minimize the heat gain to tanks and chiller losses just from lines. Excuse me, when we talk about material use, one approach for looking at what's going in and what's coming out, now you can start looking at inputs and output charts where you say, how much packaging is coming in the door and how much packaging is going out as trash. Setting targets, looking for local sourcing opportunities if there's an issue with how far do you have to ship your solid waste, and is that costing you extra money? Looking at biodegradable and recycled packaging. When I say recycled packaging, how much is your packaging cost you because it's a virgin cardboard versus recycled cardboard? Biodegradability for packaging is still kind of in its infancy, so it's out there, but it's not something that's happening anytime soon. And then finally, you look at inputs and outputs related to, for instance, in this case, cleaning, mostly looking at the chemical end of cleaning. So your standard cleaning operation, pre-rinse, cleaning with the chemicals, post-cleaning rinse, which may include a sanitizer, and then your final rinse. Can you reuse those cleaning chemicals multiple times? A typical CIP system can be set up for recycling for several cycles before you either have to dispose of the cleaner or filter the cleaner and so on. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the final rinse could potentially be used for pre-rinsing. Packaging, the whole question of glass bottles, whether it's corks, whether it's caps, the bag-in-a-box type of wines, shipping boxes, and the last one that I just heard about was wine in a can, which is a little different, but it's out there. And then looking at barrels, what kind of cleaning alternatives besides just soaking cleaning chemicals in a barrel. So potentially steam cleaning, or again, literally a CIP system specifically for the barrels. And what do you do with the barrels at end of life? Can they be repaired? Can they be repurposed, and so on? Then finally, just to kind of give it a general overview for source reduction, when you have a product and you have a process change, how do you and you need to make a process change, how do you deal with that? Can you make toxics reductions by switching to a green chemistry, which again may actually have a positive impact if you're talking about being able to field spread your wastewater. So is it something that's biodegradable versus not biodegradable? In-process recycling, again, I mentioned reuse of materials in process, so cleaning chemistries in a water supply for CIP. Other recycling, every once in a while, somebody comes up with interesting ideas like grape seed oil as a product, and I'm not sure where that market is anymore, but for a while it was a big deal. Can you go to an anaerobic digester versus sending your wastewater out for municipal wastewater, wastewater treatment, excuse me. And then treatment and disposal. Can you convert your waste to something else that's maybe more usable? So for instance, composting, do you have enough to compost that you can actually do a business out of composting and make a compost one of your products? So are there other ways to deal with stuff that normally would be considered waste that you have to deal with, make it into a product? Cornell, I know in the years past has done a lot of work on, I'll call it wine packaging. So to study on caps versus corks and synthetic corks versus natural corks. But the idea is, can you improve your process? Can you improve your product and potentially reduce the waste going either out the door and or consumer waste? Okay, so the next step now is going to be Chris talking to us about the actual, what are we going to do with our workbook and what else can we do?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so we have a draft form of a workbook to collect some of these practices and to get you thinking about these things and to get you measuring your usage and evaluating it in a way that you can then, see where you are on the spectrum and see what changes you might be able to make, see where the low-hanging fruit is, no pun intended, or maybe intended, I don't know. But so we'd like to do this, and so we need helpers to beta test it because we're sure it's not ready for prime time yet. And so we will, a few people to kick the tires around would be great. And I think there are ways we can make it worth your while. We can probably, cover the costs for your meters or, the things that you'll need to start doing this. And maybe we can even provide a little bit of time from some students or some interns to help to do some initial data collection and some fact finding and things like that. So we will try to make it as painless as possible, because we feel like once people are using this book, one, it will improve it, and two, if we start to collect and consolidate all the data, we'll start to find baselines for New York wineries. We'll start to find best practices for New York wineries, and then you'll be able to really see where you are and have access to what the best practices are. And so that, I think that will help people to really be able to start improving their processes, reducing their waste, reducing their costs. And so it should be helpful for everybody. The first step is going to be the hardest step. That's to get people enrolling in this. We don't expect that this harvest time will be a time when you have extra resources necessarily, but we hope that this is in the back of your mind. So coming out of harvest, we can start to get people lined up to be using these. As a part of this, we've got, my contact information is right here on the webinar. We will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who's registered for this webinar with a link to the recording, with a link to the survey, with a link to the proposed general permit guidelines, I think. So those three things. And we hope that you will continue this conversation. We hope that you will start to talk about this and think about this and think about ways that we can all make these businesses more sustainable. We know that fresh water is not becoming more plentiful. We know that energy is not becoming more plentiful. So we hope that we can start to move towards more sustainable practices and help your bottom line as well. With that, I think we're getting ready to close unless there are any questions from the chat bar or anything like that. Looks like we're all set. All right, so thanks again for attending. We hope you have a great harvest. We hope that,
One question.
oh yeah.
What kind of filtration would work for wineries?
All right. I will address that question offline, I think, because that's not exactly for this particular webinar. All right, so thanks again for attending, and we will be in touch. Goodbye.